The Empire of Aht Urhgan has been isolationist for as long as historical accounts recall. Situated on the west coast of the Argira continent, the empire was far removed from the conflicts in the Quan and Mindatia continents, conflicts between the enlightened races and between men and beastmen. The concerns and troubles of those in the Middle Lands, to use a term from the empire's citizens, did not matter when their own imperial ambitions and affairs held precedence. The sole exception to this strict policy of isolation was with the Tavnasian marquisate. Tavnasia, itself somewhat detached from continental affairs given its remote location, had enjoyed generations of cultural and intellectual exchange with Aht Urhgan in the form of immigration. Even during the Crystal War, a massive conflict between the Allied forces and the Beastmen Confederate, Aht Urhgan retained its isolationist policy despite envoys from the Allies pleading for aid. The diplomatic mission was headed by the Kingdom of Sandoria, and it attempted to bring Aht Urhgan into the conflict under the premise that the Beastmen Confederation's conquest would not cease with the subjugation of the Middle Lands. Their case failed to persuade the incumbent emperor, who was himself uneasy about committing forces to a foreign conflict against Beastmen, since the empire had been observing a long sought-after truce with the Ugudo Mikado on their eastern borders. Although they felt justified in their inaction, Aht Urhgan's reputation among the nations of the Allied forces certainly took a beating. They would never forget how many lives could have been saved if the Empire had just brought its might to bear. In reality, the Empire had not been completely honest with the Allies as to why it could not spare any of its forces. While it's true that a fair of its army was occupied with maintaining border security and the terms of its truce with the Mikado, the Empire had also been dealing with a major problem on its western border. Beastmen factions had been besieging the imperial capital, intent on seizing Aht Urhgan's national treasure, the Astral Candescence. The Empire was concerned that if the Allied forces also knew about the true nature of their treasure, then they too would one day wish to obtain it, by force if necessary. Believed to be a relic from the Oldham civilization which came before the imperial line, the Astral Candescence emits an aura called the Astral Wind, named such because it is believed to have originated from the astral plane, the home of the avatars. The Astral Wind empowers the Empire both literally and spiritually, as it is harnessed as a source of immense energy to various ends, and also seems to have an uplifting effect on those near it. Unearthed in the depths of the Iwida subterrane, the Candescence had been moved into the Hall of Binding in Al-Zabi as a means of staving off the Bastokan Blight, a lethal plague which decimated the fledgling Republic of the Middle Lands in 711, over a century before the outbreak of the Crystal War. The Candescence is the source of Aht Urhgan's prosperity, but is also the source of much of its woe, as it invites constant attempts from beastmen to reclaim it. Beastmen who had also been prospering from its effects before it was relocated behind the bastion walls of the imperial capital. 3 armies now beset Al-Zabi regularly, the heavily armoured and armed troll mercenaries, the brutal Mamurja savages, and the cunning and relentless Lamie leading their undead swarm. With its main armies occupied on its more distant border, the Empire needed to strengthen its defences against this new threat, and to this end the imperial court revived an old tradition with the reformation of the Serpent Generals. First established by Emperor Thalam, the Serpent Generals are a group of 5 elite warriors only ever appointed by the incumbent monarch and charged with overseeing homeland defense and the upkeep of the domestic guard in times of crisis. This fellowship owes its namesake to the Serpent King Zahak, the first emperor of the current imperial line currently ruled by Empress Nashmira, and their numbering 5 symbolizes 5 of the primal elements. In this story we will explore the origins of each of the current Serpent Generals, how they came to be and why they earned their prestigious position. As ever, it's best to start from the beginning. Ruajin was a captain in the Imperial Army, specifically of the branch dedicated to homeland defense. Ruajin was respected by his subordinates and the rank and file alike for his fair but stern mannerisms, his strategic acumen, and for his willingness to perform duties deemed beneath his rank. Put simply, he was the exemplar of a leader, and his popularity had unfortunately put him into frequent contention with General Mishad. While Mishad had gained his lofty position through nepotistic maneuvering in the imperial court, Ruhajina worked his way up through the ranks. Despite his arrogance, Mishad was not a fool. He was aware of the reverence his subordinate held over himself among the troops, and he was therefore keen to remove him from the equation. His opportunity came on one fateful day when Urhgan expressed concerns over the state of Al-Zabi's defences. At this point in time, the threat of the Western Beastmen factions potentially working together, as they had been seen to do so in the Middle Lands during the Crystal War, was unrealised to all but a few which included Urhgan, who saw the impending danger and approached Mishad to persuade him to act preemptively. True to form, rather than consider the perspective of a subordinate, Mishad took Urhgan's suggestions as a personal slight against his command. Seizing upon his opportunity to sideline what he saw as a potential upstart to his position, Mishad stripped Urhgan of his rank and sentenced him to lashes for insubordination. Now demoted and still smarting from his punishment, Urhgan reported to his unit in Al-Zabi, only to find the domestic quarter in a state of chaos. His suspicions had been confirmed. A two-folded attack was underway. The troll mercenaries had allied with the Mamulja in an attempt to misdirect the main defence force and then overwhelm the capital while it was relatively undefended. The Imperial army had been completely outmaneuvered, and Al-Zabi found itself staring down an entire army of heavily armed trolls, with the remnants of the Homeland Guard left to defend itself. Understandably panicking, the soldiers asked Urhgan for orders, but all he could do was relay the news that he was no longer an officer and thus could do nothing. Looking around for General Mishad, the squad spotted him running away from the front line, finally aware of his folly and how his arrogance had potentially cost the lives of scores of innocents. With their general unceremoniously fleeing the battlefield in a fit of cowardice, and with everything on the line, Urhgan rallied. He assumed command of the army and relayed orders to his subordinates to form up and prepare to defend the city to the last. Although the first wave of the troll attack had taken its toll and that they had sustained losses, Urhgan's unit stood their ground. While rallying a beleaguered squad, he spotted a girl dressed in a puppet master's performance garb making her way through the battlefield. Urhgan's order for non-combatants to evacuate to safety had evidently come too late, all thanks to the inaction of Mishad. Leaving command of the unit to one of his subordinates, he gave chase, hoping to get to the girl before one of the trolls did. Urhgan found the girl before a watchtower set ablaze by a siege weapon. He yelled at her to not go any further, but his plea fell on unwilling ears. She charged into the tower. Before he could give chase, Urhgan was met with a troll cannoneer. Without any nearby cover to retreat behind, he drew his broadsword for battle. He knew he was not getting out of this one unscathed. Emerging victorious, Urhgan continued his pursuit of the girl, and not a moment too soon either, as he soon found her knocked unconscious from one of the collapsed burning beams. Getting her safely out of the tower, he discovered that she had actually run in to get an even younger girl to safety. She had been in over her head, however, and if it were not for Urhgan's intervention, she surely would have died. Given that the girl was clearly a puppet master, Urhgan concluded that she had gone into the tower to save a friend or fan of hers. He admired her bravery for such a selfless act, but nevertheless felt it appropriate to reprimand her for her recklessness. Before he could raise any more words of concern, the girl implored him to return to the battlefield, insisting she would be alright. Understandably unconvinced by this, Urhgan began to protest, but he was cut short by the arrival of one of the immortals. The blue mage, Rishfi, seemed to know the puppet master on a first-name term basis, calling her Afmal. Why would a common puppet master, a young one at that, be on such familiar terms with Aht Urhgan's warrior elite? Compounding his confusion further, Rishfi expressed sincere relief at Afmal's safety, a degree of emotion Urhgan thought very unusual for one of the immortals. Knowing he could leave the girl in his care, Urhgan made a depart and check in on his soldiers. The battle might be winding down, but there would be matters which required his attention. It was then that Afmal noticed that Urhgan's left arm was bleeding profusely. The shrapnel from the troll's cannon shell had lodged itself in his arm. In true stoic fashion, Urhgan tried to dismiss the injury, but Afmal saw right through him. With no white mage nearby, she did what she could, using one of the ribbons from her garb to tourniquet the wound. She then asked for his name. Little did Urhgan know at that very moment, his actions on this day would prove to be the most pivotal in his entire life. Despite his gallant actions and the fact he was compelled to such action when General Mishad had fled, Urhgan had still circumvented the chain of command and overstepped his boundaries. In the weeks following his successful defense of Al-Zabi, he found himself confined to barracks as a punitive measure, until a messenger arrived with an official summons to the Imperial Palace. Convinced this would be a show trial resulting in his execution, Ruajin had resigned himself to his fate. He was brought before the Grand Vizier Razfad and Empress Nashmira herself. It quickly dawned on him that this was not a court-martial, as he was commended for his actions by Razfad. He explained that the palace had been inundated with petitions from across the army and the citizenry for Ruajin's release. General Mishad had been reassigned to a provincial posting, but rather than promote Ruajin to his now vacant position, Empress Nashmira had other plans. Ruajin was instead appointed to the position of Sky Serpent General. Struggling to find appropriate words, Razfad explained to Ruajin his new powers and responsibilities that came with them. The Sky Serpent General was the supreme commander of the national defense of Aht Urhgan, answerable only to the Empress and the Grand Vizier. The Sky Serpent General was empowered to dictate military strategy and overrule the decisions of high-ranking officers on the battlefield, if deemed necessary. As a mark of his position, Ruajin was given the Algol, a legendary weapon to the people of Aht Urhgan, as it was wielded by the popular Emperor Balran in his younger days. As he walked towards the Algol, he recognized one of the automatons holding it. It belonged to the puppet master Afmal. Then, it all made sense as to why the Immortals knew the owner of this automaton. He had actually rescued Empress Nashmira herself. Razfad and Nashmira had their first assignment for the new Sky Serpent General. To help him best fulfill his duties, he was to seek out and recruit 4 individuals, without regard for lineage or station, to fill the vacant positions of the other 4 Serpent Generals. The task and responsibility that lay before Ruajin was immense, but never one to shy away from adversity, he had a good idea where to begin, and thus the saga of the Serpents begins. During his time in the Imperial Army, Ruajin had heard stories, not many of them savoury either, of a band of shock troopers deployed to combat Yugudo incursions along the eastern borders of the Empire, and to launch reprisal raids. These warriors were known as the Inexorables, and were immediately identifiable by their mastery of scythes and black magic. Although they counted some of the Empire's most brutal warriors among their ranks, it was their commander whose name was so infamous among the Yugudo that his mere mention could have their hardiest looking around in terrified trepidation. The commander's name was Ghadala. Upon first meeting him, one would have been forgiven for wondering how Ruajin could have ever recruited Ghadala given his ferocious temper and distinct lack of tact. However, following a sharper contrast, similarities between the two emerge, similarities which explain why Ghadala was sought out. Both men commanded extraordinary amounts of respect from their subordinates. Both were perfectly willing to fulfill duties deemed beneath them if it helped, and above all, both cared deeply for those under their command and for those they sought to protect. The main difference, however, is likely what proved to confirm Ruajin's decision about him. Ruajin cut a classic stoic figure, seldom showing overt emotion and maintaining a guise of collected control, but Ghadala was the literal personification of a firebrand. Ghadala's mannerisms led many onlookers to think he did not care for others, but this could not have been further from the truth. The reality was that Ghadala actually cared too much. One tale in particular could well have been what compelled Ruajin to track Ghadala down. During one of the Inexorables' raids into Mikado territory, Ghadala released a young Yugudo his unit had taken as a hostage. Ghadala was willing to do some questionable things to achieve goals, but threatening the lives of children was definitely not one of them. Unfortunately, for his compassion, Ghadala and his unit paid a heavy price, as the youngling ran to the nearest Mikado fort and informed the garrison where the Inexorables were camped out. Realizing what had happened, Ghadala and his lieutenant Shaiya helped the advancing Yugudo to give the rest of the Inexorables enough time to flee back across the border. Facing a dire scenario, Ghadala made a brash but decisive decision to try pull victory from the jaws of defeat. He told Shaiya to turn him over as an offering and token of her feigned allegiance to the Mikado. Ghadala was close to all those who composed the Inexorables, but he was especially close to Shaiya. Whether it was mutual professional respect or something deeper, we will likely never know, but the fact Ghadala was willing to do this for her speaks volumes in of itself. As mad as the improvised plan was, it actually worked. So eager were the Mikado to get their hands on the notorious Ghadala, they allowed Shaiya to join their legion. a ploy which began in earnest but would not persist when she turned her back on Aht Urhgan entirely upon seeing the value of the Mikado's meritocracy. Of course, no prison could hold Ghadala for long, and after enduring a brutal stay in the Mikado's care, he broke out and rained unholy havoc upon them in retribution. This is where Urhgan found him. All he had to do was follow the trail of incinerated Yugudo bodies. Ghadala, in full flow with his infamous rage, found it difficult to discern friend from foe, having been behind enemy lines for so long, so his first meeting with Urhgan almost proved to be their last. Through no small feat to be certain, Urhgan subdued Ghadala and brought him back to the capital, where he asked him to become his first appointment to the ranks of the Serpent Generals. With his unit disbanded, Ghadala saw an opportunity for a renewed purpose, so he took Urhgan up on his offer, fittingly taking the title of Flame Serpent General. Ghadala's experiences with the Mikado had affected him, so before continuing his search, Urhgan made sure to see to his first recruit. Ironing out their differences between their drastically contrasting personalities, Urhgan and Ghadala eventually reached an understanding of each other. Difficult as it was getting Ghadala on side, it was ultimately a wise first choice from the Sky Serpent General. One size does not fit all when leadership is concerned. Urhgan knew this all too well from his experiences dealing with Mishad. If he was to potentially command an entire army, then he would need comrades who could communicate with those who might not respond to his brand of stoicism. He needed to recruit those who shared his traits but brought their own style of leadership to complement the Serpent Generals as a whole. As for Shaiha, she and Ghadala would indeed cross paths again when she attempted to steal him away from his new life. Shaiha's tenure in the Mikado Special Forces had made her acknowledge what she thought was a better way of life, one based on merit rather than nepotism. Ghadala agreed with her on that particular sentiment, but he could not forgive the Mikado for their militaristic zeal, which had been the catalyst for his leading the Inexorables in the first place. Realizing that her once feigned affection was now genuine and that their ideologies put them at an impasse, the two clashed, yet neither could bring themselves to land the decisive killing blow. It must have looked like a particularly heated sparring match, as if the two were doing more than just looking to best the other in battle. Perhaps embers of a mutual affection still burned after all this time. Ghadala emerged victorious but refused to finish Shaiha off, allowing her to slip away. Out of respect or affection, we will likely never know. Issues flaring up like this would be part and parcel of Ghadala's presence in the Serpent Generals, but to those who could take the heat of his mannerisms would eventually find the good soul that fueled his flames. Join me next time for the next tale in the Saga of the Serpents, as Urhgan and Ghadala continue their search for those worthy of filling the ranks. No matter how one begins, despite all one may stand for and hold dear, sometimes a person's life can be defined by one pivotal moment, when they are forced to take a decision they would not force on their worst enemy.